The morning Cornelius Watkins set 2 plates on the breakfast table for the 1097th time. His ranch hand Domingo Reyes leaned against the doorframe and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the first year. It was the spring of 1884, and the Oklahoma Territory was still raw and untamed, the kind of land that swallowed promises whole and spit out only the bones of them. The sky over Watkins Ranch stretched wide and indifferent, a pale blue dome that arched over red dirt roads and buffalo grass that rippled like a slow brown sea all the way to the horizon. Cornelius had built his ranch on a parcel of land northeast of the small town of Caldwell, Kansas, right where the Cherokee Strip began its long southward lean toward Indian Territory. He had built it with the understanding that he would not be building it alone for long. 3 years ago, he had placed an advertisement in the matrimonial news out of Chicago, and a woman named Augusta Rhodes of Richmond, Virginia, had written back with a letter so precise and so honest that Cornelius had read it 4 times before folding it carefully and placing it inside the cedar box he kept on the mantelpiece. She had written that she was 23 years old, that she had been raised on her father's tobacco plantation until the war and the years after had taken everything, that she could cook and sew and manage a household, and that she was not looking for romance so much as she was looking for a fair partnership with a decent man in a place where her past could not follow her. She had written it plainly, without flourish, and that plainness had moved him more than poetry might have done. He had written back. They had exchanged 7 letters over 4 months. She had agreed to come. He had sent train fare and a money order for traveling expenses, and he had fixed up the 2nd bedroom and bought new curtains and a proper vanity mirror, and had even planted a row of yellow roses along the front porch rail, because her last letter mentioned she had always loved yellow roses. He had gone to the train station in Caldwell on the appointed Tuesday in April of 1881, dressed in his best white shirt and his good boots, and he had stood on the platform while 3 trains came and went, and Augusta Rhodes had not been on any of them. He had written to the address she had given him in Richmond, Virginia. The letter came back unopened 2 months later with a notation in a postal clerk's hand that said simply, "Party no longer at this address." And so Cornelius Watkins had done what a man does when he has no other reasonable option. He had gone home. He had fed his cattle. He had mended his fences. He had set the table every morning for 2, because the act of doing it felt like keeping a door open rather than nailing it shut, and Cornelius was not the kind of man who nailed doors shut until he had a very good reason to. Domingo Reyes had never spoken a word against the habit. He was 26, lean as a fence post and twice as reliable, and he had worked for Cornelius for 4 years, which meant he had watched the whole of this particular grief without ever once being asked to comment on it. He watched now as Cornelius poured coffee into both cups and sat down in his own chair and ate his eggs and left the 2nd plate untouched, the way he always did, and then after breakfast scraped that 2nd plate clean into the slop bucket, rinsed it, and set it back in the cupboard, just as he always did. "Mail came yesterday," Domingo said finally, moving into the kitchen and pouring his own coffee from the pot on the stove. "I forgot to give it to you." "Letter from your brother in Abilene." Cornelius nodded and unfolded the letter from the stack on the counter. His brother Wallace wrote once a month with the kind of news that accumulated in a cattle town, small things mostly, who had sold what herd, whether the drought was breaking, which saloons had changed hands. But at the bottom of this particular letter, Wallace had added a postscript in a different ink, as though he had thought of it after already sealing and then reopening the envelope. The postscript said, "Heard a woman in town asking after Caldwell and the ranches near the Cherokee Strip. Said she was looking for a man named Watkins. Gave her your general direction. Thought you'd want to know. She looked like she had been through something considerable." Cornelius read the postscript twice. He set the letter down on the table beside the untouched second coffee cup and stared at the window where the morning light was coming in golden and dust-thick through the glass. "Trouble?" Domingo asked. "I don't know yet," Cornelius said. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and brown from years of working under the Oklahoma Territory sun, with dark hair that curled a little at the collar and gray eyes that people sometimes described as calm and sometimes described as wary, depending on how well they knew him. He had come west from Missouri in 1878, 25 years old and carrying $60, a good horse, and the stubborn certainty that the land itself was worth whatever it cost. He had been right about that. The ranch had grown from a single sod structure and 10 head of cattle to a proper frame house with a covered porch, a stone well, a barn, a smoke house, a bunkhouse for Domingo and the 2 other hands, and nearly 300 head of cattle ranging across 400 acres. He had done it methodically and without complaint, and the only thing that had not gone as planned in 6 years of building was the woman who had not come on the Tuesday train. He folded Wallace's letter and put it in his shirt pocket and went out to the day's work. She arrived on a Wednesday. He did not know it was her at first. He was in the near pasture, checking the water trough and watching the sky for weather when Domingo appeared at the fence rail and said, "Rider coming up the South Road. Woman. Alone." Cornelius stood up straight and shaded his eyes. The South Road was the one that came in from the direction of Caldwell, and the figure coming along it was indeed a woman on horseback, sitting very straight in the saddle despite the fact that the horse under her was moving at the slow, careful walk of an animal that had been ridden too far. She was wearing a dark blue dress that had been made for city wearing and not for the territory, and a straw hat tied under her chin against the wind, and she had a carpet bag strapped to the back of the saddle with what appeared to be a length of rope. Cornelius climbed the fence without hurrying and walked across the yard toward the gate. The woman pulled her horse up at the gate and looked at him through the dust she had raised, and he looked at her, and there was a long moment in which neither of them said anything, because the moment required its own particular kind of silence before it could be spoken into. She was not what he had imagined, or rather, she was more specific than imagination could have built. She was perhaps 26 now, which meant the mathematics of the years added up correctly, and she had the kind of face that held its character visibly, dark eyes that did not flinch from looking directly at a person, a mouth that seemed accustomed to being pressed together against things it was not yet ready to say, and a general bearing that suggested she had come through considerable trouble and had arrived, improbably, on the other side of it still standing. She was also, quite clearly, exhausted. There were shadows under her eyes and a thinness to her cheeks that suggested several months of not eating particularly well. "I am looking for Cornelius Watkins," she said. Her voice was low and steady and carried the vowels of Virginia underneath the dust of the road. "You found him," Cornelius said. Another silence. The wind moved through the buffalo grass and rattled the gate latch. "I am Augusta Rhodes," she said, and she said it the way a person says something they have been rehearsing and have not found a better way of saying. Cornelius looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the 7 letters in the cedar box on the mantelpiece. He thought about the platform in Caldwell and the 3 trains in the April afternoon that had turned to evening while he waited. He thought about the 1,097 mornings. He thought about the second coffee cup. "I know," he said. "Get down off that horse. She looks tired." Augusta Rhodes looked slightly taken aback by this, as though she had been prepared for a different opening, but she swung down from the saddle with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent considerable time on horseback recently, though the wince when her feet hit the ground told him her body was protesting the distance she had covered. Domingo materialized from somewhere behind Cornelius with the timing he always had in a situation, quiet and useful, and took the horse's reins without being asked. "I'll water her and brush her down," Domingo said. "She's a good horse. She's earned it." Augusta looked at Domingo with something that might have been gratitude or might have been wariness or might have been both together, which was a reasonable combination for a woman traveling alone through the territory. She pulled the carpetbag free from the rope ties and held it in front of her with both hands. Cornelius opened the yard gate and held it. "Come inside," he said. "I have coffee on." She walked through the gate and he walked beside her toward the house, and he was aware that this was an extraordinary situation being handled with a great deal of ordinary decorum, and he was not entirely sure whether that was the right approach, but it was the one he had, and so he kept to it. Inside the kitchen, he poured coffee into 2 cups and set them on the table. He saw the moment she registered that there were already 2 cups set out, the table already laid for 2, and he saw something cross her face that he could not entirely read. She sat down in the chair he indicated and wrapped both hands around the cup. "I expect you want an explanation," she said. "I expect I'm owed one," Cornelius said carefully, sitting down across from her. "But you look like you need coffee and something to eat before you give it." "I am perfectly capable of speaking while eating," Augusta said, with the first edge of real feeling in her voice, which he thought was probably a good sign. He got up and put a pan on the stove and sliced bread and cut cold beef from the joint he had in the larder, and while he cooked he listened to her begin. She had, it turned out, fully intended to come. She had packed her trunk and said her goodbyes and gone to the train station in Richmond on the appointed Monday to begin the journey that would have her in Caldwell on Tuesday. But at the station she had been met by her older brother Hensley, who had somehow discovered what she was planning, and Hensley had not been on his own. He had brought with him a man named Gerald Fitch, who was a lawyer and the son of one of the remaining wealthy families in the county, and who had for the previous year and a half been attempting to convince Augusta to marry him instead. Hensley had taken Augusta's ticket from her hands and told her that Gerald Fitch had paid the family's outstanding debts, all of them, the considerable accumulated debts of a family that had been attempting to maintain the old life without the old resources, and that in exchange Augusta had been, in Hensley's framing, promised. Augusta had not been informed of this arrangement. She had been presented with it at a train station while she was trying to leave for Kansas. Cornelius set the plate in front of her and sat back down. His jaw was tight, but he kept his voice even. "And you went with him?" "I did not go with him willingly," Augusta said. "I went home because I had no money of my own. My trunk was in the station, and my brother had just told me our family owed over $2,000 to various creditors including the local bank, and that Gerald Fitch had paid all of it." She paused. "I want to be clear about what I mean when I say I did not go willingly. I mean that I went home, and I spent the next several months trying to find a legal or practical means of not doing what they intended for me to do." "Which was marrying Fitch." "Yes. And did you?" He asked it flatly. He needed to know the answer. "No," Augusta said just as flatly. "I did not." He let out a breath he had not entirely known he was holding. "I was 18 months trying to get out of that arrangement," she continued, eating as she talked, and he noticed she ate carefully, the way a person eats when they have been hungry often enough to remember not to go too fast. "I wrote to you 3 times. My brother intercepted the letters, I believe, because you never replied." She looked at him steadily. "I did not know whether you had simply moved on. I wrote anyway." "I never received any letters after the first round," Cornelius said. "My last letter to you came back unopened." "The address changed when we lost the house," Augusta said. "We were staying with my aunt by then. The arrangement was meant to be the solution to all of that. New house, debts paid. Fitch got what he wanted." Her voice was very controlled. "I was, in everyone's accounting, what he wanted." Cornelius looked at this woman sitting at his kitchen table in her travel-worn city dress with her carpetbag on the floor beside her chair, and he thought about what it must have cost her to keep herself together through a year and a half of that kind of being accounted for. "How did you get out?" he asked. "Gerald Fitch's existing debts caught up with him," Augusta said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite satisfaction but lived in the same neighborhood. He had made certain financial arrangements in several cities that all came due at approximately the same time in the fall of 1882. He was not, it turned out, as financially secure as he had presented himself to my brother. He could not pay back what he owed to the bank as he had promised, and the entire agreement collapsed. She paused. My brother was furious with me, as though it were my fault that Fitch had been a fraud. We have not spoken since. I spent the winter of 1882 working as a schoolteacher in a town called Harper's Mill in Western Virginia, and in the spring of last year I began working my way west. Working your way west, Cornelius repeated. School teaching, mostly, she said. Taught in 3 different towns getting here. I'm not without skills. There was the edge again, careful and real. I never said you were, Cornelius said. She ate a little more. He drank his coffee. Outside the window the day was getting bright and the cattle in the near pasture were moving slowly toward the shade of the cottonwood grove. I want to say something, Augusta said, setting down her fork. And I want to say it directly. All right, he said. I am 3 years late, she said. I am aware of that. I am aware that you waited, and that the waiting cost you something, and that you are owed an apology for the delay. She paused, and he noticed that she had said he was owed an apology, but she had not, at that point, given one. She seemed to be arriving at something carefully. But I cannot apologize for the circumstances that delayed me, because I did not create those circumstances, and I fought them for as long as they had the power to bind me. I can tell you that I wanted to come, that I had intended to come from the first letter, that I thought about it during those 18 months in a way that made it harder, not easier, to accept what my brother had arranged. I do not know if that is sufficient. I only know it is true. Cornelius Watkins looked at Augusta Rhodes across his kitchen table for a long moment. He was a man who had spent 3 years setting a second place at breakfast, which was not a thing a man did if he was the kind of man who gave up easily on what he had once decided mattered to him. He thought about the right thing to say, and he thought about it carefully, the way he thought about most things. I set your place every morning, he said, just in case. Augusta went very still. I didn't do it out of foolishness, he continued, in the same measured tone. I did it because I decided when I got home from Caldwell that first Tuesday that I would rather keep the door open than shut it. Because I didn't know what had happened to you, and I didn't want to decide you'd simply changed your mind until I had something more than absence to tell me that. He paused. So I'm not going to ask you to apologize for circumstances you didn't choose, but I would like you to stay if you came here intending to stay. Augusta's dark eyes had something in them now that was different from the controlled steadiness she had worn since the gate. I came here intending to stay, she said quietly. Then stay, he said. We can figure out the rest. Domingo knocked on the doorframe at that moment with the particular timing that Cornelius was beginning to believe was actually a kind of mercy on the man's part. Horse is doing fine, Domingo said. I put her in the stall next to Hector. She and Hector seem to be getting along. Good, Cornelius said. Domingo, this is Augusta Rhodes. She'll be staying in the second bedroom while we settle the formal arrangements. Miss Rhodes, Domingo Reyes has been with this ranch for 4 years and I trust him entirely. Domingo took his hat off with a natural politeness. Miss Rhodes, Augusta nodded. Mr. Reyes, thank you for caring for my horse. Her name is Patience. Domingo smiled at this, brief and genuine. Good name for a horse that's come this far, he said, and put his hat back on and went back out. The formal arrangements, it turned out, required sending for the circuit preacher who came through the Caldwell area every 6 weeks, a Reverend Thomas Biggs who was a practical man with a practical view of his duties in a territory where the infrastructure of civilization was still being built largely on the fly. They sent word to him through a rider going into Caldwell on Thursday, and Reverend Biggs sent back word that he would be at the Watkins ranch the following Saturday, which was his scheduled stop in the area anyway. This gave Cornelius and Augusta 5 days to exist in the same house and on the same property, and begin the complex and interesting process of becoming acquainted with each other in person rather than through letters. It was not without friction. Augusta Rhodes had strong opinions about the organization of a kitchen, and she was not shy about expressing them on Friday morning when she went to make breakfast and found that Cornelius kept his flour on the wrong side of the stove and his coffee beside the back door, which she said made no logical sense whatsoever. Cornelius, who had kept his flour and coffee in those locations for 6 years without difficulty, said so. "It makes sense if you are the only person here," Augusta replied, moving the coffee canister to the shelf above the stove with the brisk efficiency of someone who had made this decision and was not revisiting it. "It makes considerably less sense when another person is trying to work around you." Cornelius watched his coffee canister migrate across the kitchen. "I see," he said. "You may see that it is better this way within the week," Augusta told him. He discovered she was right within 2 days, which he chose not to mention, and which she appeared to understand without needing to be told. She was, beyond the question of kitchen geography, a genuinely competent person. She took stock of the vegetable garden behind the house and determined within an hour what it needed, which was attention and the removal of the encroaching grass, and she proceeded to give it attention on Saturday morning before Reverend Biggs arrived, in a different dress, a practical blue calico that she had apparently packed in anticipation of actual ranch living, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her straw hat back on her head. Cornelius came around the corner of the house on his way to the barn and stopped at the sight of her, absorbed in her work, humming something low and unhurried under her breath. The yellow roses he had planted 3 years ago were blooming along the porch rail, a detail he had not thought about until the moment she stood up from the garden, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked at them. She looked at the roses for a long time, then she looked at him. "You planted those," she said. It was not a question. "3 years ago," he said. "You mentioned them in your last letter." The expression on her face in that moment was one he would remember for a long time, something that moved through her like a current finding its way through new ground, something that started with the recognition of the fact and ended somewhere that was not quite the same as where it had started. "I did," she said softly. "I wrote that I had always loved them." "I know," he said. She turned back to the roses and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, still looking at them, "I thought about those letters a great deal during those 18 months. I had nothing to hold onto from them, nothing written down, because Hensley was going through everything. But I remembered what I had said in them. I remembered what you had said back." She paused. "You wrote in your 4th letter that you thought a person's past was their own business and that the point of going west was to live forward." "I did say that," he agreed. "I held on to that," Augusta said. She looked at him then with those direct dark eyes and did not look away. "It was a good thing to have written." Reverend Biggs arrived at 11 on Saturday morning in a wagon driven by his wife, a small, energetic woman named Edna, who immediately made friends with Augusta over the state of the vegetable garden and the quality of the coffee, which had been moved to the correct shelf. The ceremony was short and practical, conducted in the front room of the house with Domingo and the other 2 ranch hands, Pete Calloway and a young man of 19 called George Sutton, serving as witnesses. Augusta wore the dark blue dress she had arrived in, which was the best she had, and Cornelius wore his good white shirt and his good boots, the same ones he had worn on the platform in Caldwell 3 years ago, which seemed appropriate. When Reverend Biggs asked if anyone knew any impediment to the marriage, there was a moment of silence during which Cornelius thought he saw Augusta draw one brief, careful breath. And then there was no impediment, because there wasn't one. The only thing that might have stood in the way having collapsed in Virginia a year and a half ago under the weight of Gerald Fitch's fraudulent finances. They said their vows plainly, without great ceremony, and when Biggs pronounced them married and looked at Cornelius with the expectant expression of a man who knew what generally came next in this part of the proceedings, Cornelius turned to Augusta and paused, because this was new ground between them and he had no wish to presume on it. Augusta solved the problem by leaning up and pressing her lips briefly to his cheek, which was not where weddings generally concluded, but was, he thought, exactly right for where they were and who they were, which was two people who had arrived at this moment by a long and complicated road and were taking it one careful step at a time. Edna Biggs served the wedding cake she had apparently brought entirely on her own initiative, a three-layer affair with white icing that she produced from a wooden box in the wagon with the air of a woman who had been doing this long enough to know that frontier weddings benefited from someone showing up with a plan. In the days that followed the wedding, Cornelius and Augusta moved through the house and the property with the deliberate, slightly careful courtesy of two people who were genuinely trying to know each other without the benefit of the long courtship that might have preceded such a marriage under other circumstances. They were married. They were also, in most of the ways that mattered, still strangers, and they both seemed to understand this and to take it as a project rather than a problem. Augusta learned the rhythms of the ranch with the attentiveness she seemed to give to most things, watching and then doing, asking questions that were precise and practical. She learned the names of the cattle that had names, which was more of them than Cornelius had realized he'd named, until she pointed it out with a small smile. She learned that Pete Calloway was reliable but slow-moving, and that George Sutton was quick but needed direction, and that Domingo Reyes was, as Cornelius had told her, entirely trustworthy. She also, within the first week, rearranged the front room. Cornelius came in from the evening feeding to find that the chairs had been turned toward the window instead of toward the fire, and that the cedar box he kept on the mantelpiece had been dusted. He stopped and looked at the cedar box. Augusta, setting the supper table, looked up and read his expression with the accuracy that he was already beginning to find characteristic of her. "I only dusted the outside of it," she said. "I didn't open it." "It has your letters in it," he said. A pause. "My letters," she repeated. "The 7 from before you were supposed to come," he said. "I kept them." Augusta set down the spoon she was holding and looked at the box on the mantelpiece for a moment. Then she said, "May I read them?" "They're your words," he said. "They were always yours." She crossed to the mantelpiece and opened the box and took out the folded letters, and she sat down in one of the chairs that now faced the window and read her own 3-year-old words in the evening light while Cornelius finished setting the table. He watched her sideways while he worked, the way the fading light came through the window and lay across her face, the way she was very still while she read, the slight change in her expression as she moved from one letter to the next. When she finished, she folded them back carefully and replaced them in the cedar box and set it back on the mantelpiece. "I had forgotten how much I said," she told him. "You said everything plain," he said. "That was one of the first things I noticed." She looked at him steadily. "Most people don't take that as a compliment." "I'm not most people," he said. Something shifted in her expression then, something that was cautious and careful and beginning, slowly, to consider becoming something else. She said, "No, I'm beginning to think you're not." Supper that night was the most comfortable they had yet had, the conversation moving more easily than it had before, both of them finding that there was more ground between them that was familiar than there was ground that was strange. She had read about the territory before coming. She told him practically everything she could find, and she had formed opinions about the statehood question, and about the homestead claims, and about the relationship between the cattle ranchers and the farmers moving in on the land, and her opinions were well formed and not timid. He told her about the early years of building the ranch, the years before Domingo came, when it had been only himself and the open land and the cattle and the slow, grinding work of making something from nothing, and she listened with the focused attention she gave to everything, asking questions at the right moments and not interrupting at the wrong ones. "Were you lonely?" she asked. He considered the question honestly. "Yes," he said. "Not always, but yes." "I think a person can be lonely and still be all right," Augusta said thoughtfully. "The two don't necessarily cancel each other out. I was lonely in Harper's Mill. I was lonely teaching and moving and working my way here. But I was all right." "You seem all right," he agreed. "I am," she said, with the particular quiet certainty of someone who has tested the statement before and found it true. The summer moved forward around them, long and hot and full of the work that a ranch demanded without pause. Augusta took over the kitchen and the house with a thoroughness that had a care behind it he had not expected, not the mechanical competence of someone performing a duty, but the actual investment of a person who was making something her own. The vegetable garden under her management became extraordinarily productive. She preserved and pickled and dried with the systematic efficiency of someone who had grown up understanding that winter was always coming. She also, in the evenings, began a correspondence course in surveying and land law that she had apparently been pursuing for the better part of a year, sending and receiving packets of materials through the Caldwell post office. Cornelius discovered this on a Tuesday evening in July when he came in from the barn and found her at the kitchen table surrounded by papers covered in angles and calculations, frowning at a diagram. "What is this?" he asked, looking over her shoulder. "Land law," she said without looking up, "and survey mathematics. I have been thinking about the southern pasture and whether the line fence is actually where you believe it to be. I think your neighbor Hargrove may have moved it." He pulled out a chair and looked at the papers more carefully. "Hargrove," he said, "you've been studying the survey records." "Since I arrived," she said. "I went to the county records in Caldwell 3 weeks ago when I was there for supplies." "Did you know the original survey for this property had a creek bend as a landmark, and the creek has shifted east by perhaps 40 feet since 1878? Cornelius stared at the diagram. He had had a low-grade suspicion about that fence line for 2 years and had done nothing about it because the business of proving anything seemed complicated. "How do you know about survey mathematics?" "I taught myself," she said simply, as though this was a perfectly natural thing to have done, which perhaps, for Augusta Rhodes, it was. Geometry is geometry. The legal language requires more study, but it is learnable. If Hargrove has moved that fence, which I believe he has, then you are missing approximately 12 acres of grazing land that belongs to this property." He looked at her. He looked at the papers. He said, "When did you have time to do all of this?" "Early mornings," she said, "before breakfast." He sat down properly in the chair and looked at his wife, who had arrived 3 years late from Virginia with a carpetbag tied to a borrowed horse and had within 6 weeks identified a property dispute he had been half aware of and had not known how to pursue. "All right," he said. "What do we do about it?" "We get a proper survey done," she said. "There is a land surveyor in Wichita. I have written to him." She looked up at him then, and a flicker of something uncertain crossed her face. "I should have mentioned it before writing. I didn't think about it as something that required—" She paused. "Augusta," he said quietly, "you were right not to think of it that way. It's your ranch, too." The uncertainty cleared. "All right," she said. "Good." And she went back to her diagram. He stayed at the table with her that evening while she worked, reading the newspaper he had been too tired to read the night before, and the quietness between them that settled was a different kind of quietness than the careful courtesy of the first weeks. It was the quietness of two people who were, gradually and thoroughly, beginning to fit. The surveyor came from Wichita in August, a precise German-American man named Schraber who spent 2 days walking the property boundaries with his instruments, and who produced, at the end of the second day, a survey that confirmed everything Augusta had calculated. The fence had been moved, not by 40 feet, as she had estimated, but by 38, which was close enough to be impressive and sufficiently different to prompt a small smile from her when Schraber told them. The resolution of the fence dispute with Hargrove was not entirely pleasant. Jim Hargrove was a man in his 50s who had been in the area longer than Cornelius, and who had the temper of someone accustomed to getting his way through the simple application of size and stubbornness. He came to the Watkins ranch with the survey results 2 days after they were delivered, red-faced and loud, and had an argument with Cornelius in the yard that had a certain amount of profanity and heat, before Augusta appeared on the porch with the legal survey documents in her hand, and the kind of expression that suggested she had been through more difficult conversations than this one, and had survived them. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, from the porch, in the clear carrying voice she had apparently developed from 3 years of teaching rooms full of children who did not want to listen. "I have here the survey results signed by a certified surveyor, a copy of the original land patent for this property dated 1878, and a letter from the county land office confirming the discrepancy. You are welcome to dispute the survey. The process for doing so is to file a counter-survey request with the county within 30 days. I can give you the documentation for that process." She paused. "Or you can move the fence to the correct location within 2 weeks, and we can consider the matter settled." Hargrove looked at her on the porch. He looked at Cornelius. He looked back at her. The loudness went out of him with the visible deflation of a man who has run into an argument he cannot intimidate his way through. The fence was moved within 10 days. Domingo Reyes, watching this from the barn door, had the expression of a man who had his previous good opinion thoroughly confirmed. Cornelius, for his part, found himself watching his wife with a growing attention that was no longer the careful watching of a man trying to understand who he had married. It was the attention of a man who was finding, with some regularity and no small amount of wonder, reasons to look again. She was not what he had imagined, as he had noted the first day, but she was substantially more than he had imagined, and this was a fact he was discovering new dimensions of on a regular basis. He had not said anything of this to her directly. They were careful with each other in certain ways still. The house was shared with a growing ease, and there were conversations now that ran late into the evenings, and a companionship in the daily work of the ranch that felt solid and real. But there was still a distance in some things, a courtesy that was partly consideration and partly, he thought, a mutual uncertainty about how to move from the kind of partnership they had built in letters into the kind of partnership that meant something more than practical accord. He was thinking about this one evening in late August when he was mending harness on the front porch, and Augusta came out and sat in the other chair with the mending she always had on hand, and they worked in silence for a while in the blue evening with the crickets starting up in the grass and the sky going from orange to purple over the western plains. "I want to ask you something," Augusta said, without looking up from her sewing. "All right," he said. "When you were waiting," she said slowly, "those 3 years. Did you—" she stopped and started again. "Was there anyone else you considered?" He thought about this honestly. There had been, in the 2nd year, a widow woman in Caldwell named Mrs. Patricia Crane who had made it reasonably clear that she found him agreeable, and he had thought about it for perhaps a week before setting the thought aside. "There was a woman in Caldwell who was interested," he said. "I thought about it once and then I didn't." Augusta looked up at that. "Why not?" He put down the harness and looked at her directly, the way he had learned she responded to, plainly and without the softening circumlocutions that some people found easier. "Because I had already decided on you," he said. "And I don't make those decisions easily, and I don't unmake them without a reason. Absence isn't a reason if you don't know what it means." Augusta held his gaze for a long moment. In the fading light her face had the quality of something fully itself, nothing concealed, nothing performed, just the person she was looking back at him from across a very small and suddenly very significant distance. "That is a remarkable thing to say," she said softly. "It's just true," he said. She set down her mending, which he understood was a signal of something, and she said, "I thought about you in those 18 months more than I had any right to think about someone I had never met. I thought about the letters. I thought about what you had said in them and what you hadn't said and what you might be like as a person, and whether the distance between what I imagined and what you actually were would be survivable." A pause. "I'm finding it considerably more than survivable." He felt something shift in his chest, slow and wide like a river changing course. He said, "So am I." The distance between the chairs on the porch was not very large. It closed in the way those distances close, when both people decide, at the same moment, to let it. He reached across and took her hand where it lay on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and let his fingers close around hers, and they sat like that in the full dark of the Oklahoma Territory evening, with the stars coming out one by one overhead, and the crickets very loud in the grass, and the cattle settling in the pasture. "Cornelius," she said. "Yes. I'm glad I came," she said, "even 3 years late." "I'm glad you came too," he said, "however late." The fall of 1884 brought the work that fall always brought on a cattle ranch, the weaning and sorting, and the deciding of what to sell and what to winter over, and Cornelius and Augusta worked through it together with a partnership that had by now settled into something thoroughly easy. She had, with his full agreement, taken on the financial management of the ranch, the accounts and the supply orders, and the negotiations with the buyers who came from Kansas City in September. And she proved so good at the latter that they sold their fall cattle at a price substantially better than Cornelius had made the previous year. The buyer from Kansas City, a man named Whitfield, who was accustomed to talking to the rancher and ignoring whoever else was present, had initially directed his opening offer entirely to Cornelius. Augusta had listened to the first offer, waited for Whitfield to finish, and then said, very politely, that the offer was $20 a head below market value, that she had the current Kansas City market figures in her hand, and that she was sure Mr. Whitfield had simply misspoken. The look on Whitfield's face suggested he was reevaluating the nature of this transaction, and he left having paid what the cattle were actually worth. "You enjoyed that," Cornelius said, after Whitfield's wagon had left. "I enjoyed the outcome," Augusta said precisely. He laughed. It was a full laugh, the kind that surprised him with its own ease, and Augusta turned at the sound of it with an expression that was startled into delight, as though she had not quite expected that laugh from him, and her own smile in response was the most unguarded he had yet seen from her, open and warm in a way that made the whole of her different for a moment. "You should laugh more often," she told him. "It suits you." "You should smile like that more often," he replied. "Same reason." They looked at each other for a moment in the yard with the dust from Whitfield's wagon still settling, and then Augusta tucked the market figures into her apron pocket and said, practically, that supper was not going to make itself, and went inside. But the smile lingered on her face as she went, and Cornelius stood in the yard for a moment after she disappeared through the door, feeling the particular warmth of a man who has found himself, somewhere between the planning and the doing of it, in the middle of something real and good. October came in with a blue norther that drove the temperature down 40 degrees in 3 hours, the way the territory weather did, with a theatrical completeness that still startled him after 6 years. The cattle got through it, tucked into the southeast corner of the pasture where the cottonwood grove broke the wind, but it meant 3 days of hard work breaking ice on the water troughs and keeping the barn stove going and the hay moving. Augusta worked alongside him through all of it without complaint, and without the need to be shown more than once how anything was done. On the second day, when they came in from the second morning feed cold through and ice-caked, she went straight to the stove and had hot coffee and hot food on the table in 20 minutes, and Domingo and Pete and young George Sutton came in from the bunkhouse looking like men who had been working in a blue norther and ate with the gratitude of people who recognize that being fed well in miserable circumstances is a significant gift. "Mrs. Watkins," George Sutton said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup, "I want you to know that this is the best cup of coffee I have ever had in my life." "You're very cold," Augusta said. "Everything tastes better when you're very cold." "No, ma'am," George said, with the complete sincerity of 19 years old. "It genuinely is." Domingo across the table was smiling at his own cup in a private way. After the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Augusta sat at the table with her own coffee and said, "I want to write to my brother." Cornelius looked up. He had heard the story of Augusta Rhodes, and he had formed opinions about him that he was keeping to himself, at least for now. "All right," he said carefully. I'm not forgiving him, Augusta said, reading his expression with the accuracy he was accustomed to. I'm not ready for that, and I may not ever be entirely. What he did was, she paused. What he did was wrong, and it had consequences that lasted years and changed the shape of my life. I'm aware of that. She was quiet for a moment. But I don't want to carry the silence as a weight anymore. I want to tell him that I am here and that I am well and that what happened is over. I want to close the door properly rather than just walking away from it and leaving it ajar. Cornelius thought about this. He thought about the long practice of keeping doors open rather than nailing them shut. That seems like the right thing to do, he said. It may not lead to anything, she said. He may not reply, he may reply badly, but I want to do it. Then do it, he said. You don't need my permission. I wasn't asking permission, Augusta said. I was telling you what I intended to do because you are my husband and you share this life with me and you have a right to know what I'm doing in it. He looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman he had set a place for every morning for 3 years and who had arrived and rearranged his kitchen and fixed his fence line and negotiated a better cattle price and learned the names of his cows, and he thought that he had been right to keep the door open. He had been deeply and thoroughly right. Augusta, he said. Yes. I love you, he said, the first time he had said it. He had been working toward it for months the way you work toward something that matters, which is carefully and without rushing it. Augusta was very still for a moment. Then something opened in her face, the same thing he had seen before but larger this time, a current finding wider ground. I love you, she said back. Not immediately, not as a reflexive echo, but after the moment she had taken to be sure she meant it, which was the kind of response he had come to expect from her, and which meant more to him than a quicker answer would have done. The winter was a long one, but it was a good winter. They were inside a great deal, and the forced proximity of the house brought its own gifts, long evenings by the fire with books they read to each other, a habit that had begun when Augusta discovered he had a small collection he hadn't touched in years and had asked him to read aloud while she sewed, and which had evolved into an exchange where they alternated reading by chapter, each of them discovering what the other found interesting and why. He discovered she had read considerably more history than he had and had definite opinions about it, particularly about the years of Reconstruction in the South, which she had lived through as a girl on the wrong side of a collapsing world. She did not romanticize what had been lost because she had seen clearly enough what it was built on, and the directness with which she discussed it, the honesty about the injustice built into the world she had grown up in, and about the injustice of what had replaced it in terms of what it had done to the freed people she had known, was something he had not expected, and which expanded his understanding of her in ways he thought about for days. My father was not a cruel man, she said one evening, looking at the fire. He was not deliberately cruel. But he was a man who had inherited a system he did not question enough, and the people who worked his land and were not paid and could not leave suffered for his lack of questioning. I have thought about this a great deal. I think the not questioning is its own kind of choice. She paused. I think choosing not to see something because seeing it is inconvenient is a moral failure, not a neutral act. Cornelius had grown up in Missouri, which had its own complex history on these questions, and he had seen things in his own growing up years that he had thought about in exactly the way Augusta was describing. I think that's right, he said. I think that's one of the truest things a person can say. She looked at him. You've thought about this. A great deal, he said. I wondered if you had, she said. Given the territory and what's happening here with the unassigned lands and the way the government has been handling the Indian Territory. She paused. The treaties keep getting broken. I've been reading about it. The land that was promised keeps getting taken. It keeps happening and people keep justifying it, and it is the same mechanism as what you are describing, the choosing not to see. Cornelius nodded slowly. He had neighbors who talked about the upcoming land opening with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of men who were not thinking about what it meant that the land was being opened. He had not been entirely comfortable with those conversations for reasons he had not always been able to articulate. Augusta had just articulated them. "What do we do with that?" he asked. "Living here, being part of it." "I don't know that there's a clean answer," she said honestly. "I don't know that we can be here without being part of the machine of it. But I think there is a difference between people who see it and are troubled by it and try to act decently in the small ways available to them, and people who do not see it because they prefer not to. I would rather be the first kind." "So would I," he said. This conversation, which they returned to and extended over several evenings, knit them together in ways that the daily work and the practical sharing of a life could not fully do. They were not simply two people who managed the same property efficiently. They were two people who thought about the same things and, reaching their thinking from different directions, arrived at conclusions that were not identical but were seriously engaged with each other. December brought Christmas, and Augusta baked, enormously and with evident pleasure, producing quantities of gingerbread and apple cake and a sweet potato pie that made Pete Calloway express his appreciation with the reverent sincerity of a man for whom this was clearly a deeply felt moment. She had written to her aunt in Virginia in November, the aunt she had stayed with during the hard years, and a letter had come back in early December full of warmth and some news, including, carefully inserted near the end, that Hensley had received her letter and that he had not replied yet, but that the aunt thought he might, eventually, because she had seen him reading it more than once. Augusta had read this section to Cornelius in the evening by the fire and had said nothing further about it, but he had seen the small, careful hope in her face and had said nothing about it either, which was the right thing. On Christmas morning he gave her a proper surveying compass and a good leather-bound notebook for her correspondence course, and she looked at them for a moment with the expression of a person who has received exactly what they wanted and had not expected to be known so precisely. She gave him in return a new edition of a legal guide to territorial land law, and on the inside cover she had written in her clear, careful hand, "For Cornelius, who kept the door open. With all my love, Augusta." He stood in the front room reading that inscription for a long moment, while she watched him with the steady dark eyes that he had loved now for several months with a growing fullness. And then he closed the book and crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her with the full and unhurried deliberateness of a man who has arrived somewhere he intends to stay. She kissed him back with the same completeness. Outside, the snow that had been threatening since morning began to fall on the Oklahoma Territory in the long white silence of winter. January of 1885 brought its own dramas, because the territory was that kind of place. A dispute between two homesteaders on the north edge of the area devolved into an altercation that the sheriff's deputy from Caldwell had to ride out and settle, and the aftermath of it rippled through the community for weeks. There was also the ongoing question of the unassigned lands, the central section of the territory that the government had not yet formally opened to homesteading, but which everyone knew was coming, and the tension it created between the ranchers who ran cattle on it informally and the boomers who kept attempting to stake claims and being removed by the army. Cornelius had a grazing arrangement on 200 acres of the unassigned lands that he had been operating under the informal understanding that no one was paying very close attention to it, and in January a letter from the Federal Land Office made it clear that this understanding was being revised. He would need to move his winter cattle off that acreage by March. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter and Augusta sat across from him, having read it over his shoulder, and they talked about it for 2 hours that evening, working through the implications carefully. They would need to either purchase or lease additional land to replace the grazing, or they would need to reduce the herd, or some combination. Augusta had the figures for both possibilities laid out on paper within the hour, the careful columns of numbers that she had become the keeper of, and they worked through the options with the practical focus of two people who had decided that this problem, like all problems, had a solution that could be found if you looked at it steadily enough. "There's the Delacroix parcel," Cornelius said. "East of the creek. They've been trying to sell for 2 years." "How much do they want for it?" Augusta asked. "Last I heard, $800. "We have it," she said. "If we use the fall cattle proceeds and the reserve both, we have it. It would leave us lean going into the spring, but not dangerously so, and the land would be worth more than we paid within 3 years." She paused. "Also, and I have not mentioned this because I was not entirely sure of the timing, but I believe we may have another reason to think about the long-term stability of the property." Cornelius looked at her. Augusta looked back at him with the steady, direct gaze, and in it was something new, something that was careful and wondering, and a little bit frightened and larger than anything he had seen in her before. "I believe," she said, "that we are going to have a child." The silence that followed this statement was the kind that expands rather than contracts, filling the room rather than emptying it. Cornelius set down the letter from the land office and looked at his wife. He felt something move through him that was too large to be named with any single word, something that was joy and weight and the future and the past all at once, something that had the quality of the territory sky when you looked up at it suddenly and remembered how big it was. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but mostly." He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at him with those dark eyes that were, for this moment, entirely unguarded. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm feeling somewhat ill in the mornings," she admitted. "Which is, from what I understand, the correct thing to be feeling at this stage." A small, careful smile. "I am also feeling a great many other things that are harder to describe." "Frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "Happy both at once?" "Yes," he said, "that seems about right." He held her hands and she looked at him, and the evening light was coming through the window and the fire was going well, and outside the territory snow had stopped, and the night was clear and enormous. They bought the Delacroix parcel in February, and the purchase of it, combined with the news Augusta was carrying, gave the spring a quality of beginning that Cornelius had not fully anticipated when he had woken on the first morning of the year. He found himself looking at the ranch with different eyes, the house with its covered porch and its yellow roses that would bloom again in the summer, the barn with its solid stone foundation, the pastures stretching out to the fence lines that were now correctly placed, the blue Oklahoma sky arching over all of it. He had built this with the intention of not building it alone, and the intention had been delayed and had cost him 3 years of mornings with a second plate. And now, the house held the woman who had written him letters about going west to live forward, and she was carrying their first child. And Pete Calloway was teaching young George Sutton how to properly shoe a horse in the barn, and Domingo Reyes was mending fence in the south pasture whistling something that drifted in through the open barn door. And the world was very full. The letter from Augusta Rhodes arrived in March. Augusta brought it in from the Caldwell Post with the mail, and she held it for a moment on the porch before opening it, and Cornelius came and stood beside her. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She opened it and read it, and he watched her face as she did. It was not a long letter. Hensley was not, from everything she had told him, a man inclined toward the elaborate expression of complicated things, but it was, apparently, something. Her face went through several things while she read it, not all of them comfortable, but at the end she folded it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "He says he is sorry for what happened at the station. He says he thought he was doing what was necessary at the time and that he knows it was wrong and that he hopes I am well." "That's something," Cornelius said. "It is," Augusta agreed. "It is not everything, but it is something." She held the folded letter in both hands and looked out at the yard where the first green of spring was showing in the buffalo grass. "I will write back," she said. "In time, not right away. I need to think about what I want to say." "Take whatever time you need," he said. She leaned against him slightly, which was something she had begun to do in the winter, and which he had discovered he loved for what it was, not leaning because she needed to, not helplessness or dependency, but the deliberate choice of a self-sufficient person to make contact with the person they trusted most. He put his arm around her and they stood on the porch looking out at the spring morning and the new green grass and the horses moving in the near pasture. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "Those mornings," she said. "The ones you described. Setting the table for two when there was only one. 3 years of that." She turned and looked up at him. "I think about what that says about you, and I think," she paused, "I think I arrived here not knowing who you were really, only from letters, and I discovered that you are the most reliable person I have ever known. Not in the small ways, in the way that matters, the way of being someone who decides something and holds to it. I thought about giving it up sometimes," he admitted, "in the second year especially. But you didn't." "No," he said, "I didn't." "Why?" she asked. He thought about it. "Because it cost me very little to keep going," he said. "Setting an extra plate costs nothing. Keeping the door open costs nothing. And what it would have cost me to close the door and have you arrive anyway," he paused. "That seemed like a price I didn't want to pay." Augusta looked at him for a long time. "I think that is the most unsentimental and genuinely romantic thing I have ever heard anyone say," she said. He smiled at her. The smile that she had told him once appeared rarely enough to be notable. And she smiled back, the open, warm one. And he thought, as he had thought before, that the distance between what he had imagined when he first sent an advertisement to a matrimonial paper in Chicago and what had actually come through his gate on a Wednesday in May of 1884 was a distance that defied accounting. He had gotten considerably more than he had asked for. He had gotten Augusta Rhodes. The spring moved into summer and the territory was brilliant and hot and full of life. Augusta's pregnancy advanced with what she described as excessive drama, and what her body performed as something more pragmatic. She was uncomfortable and determined, and continued to manage the accounts and the correspondence and the garden right up until the point in early July when she handed Cornelius the ledger book and said, quite calmly, that it was probably time to send for the midwife. The midwife was a woman of 60 named Mrs. Clara Fontaine, who had been delivering babies in the Caldwell area for 20 years, and who arrived with the unhurried competence of someone for whom this was simply the work of the world. She sent Cornelius to wait outside, which he did, in the company of Domingo, who sat with him on the porch steps through the long July evening with the patience of a man who understood that sometimes the right thing to do was simply to be present without saying much. "It will be all right," Domingo said, at one point. "Yes," Cornelius said. "Mrs. Clara has done this many times," Domingo said. "Yes," Cornelius said again. "I am going to make coffee," Domingo said, standing up. "You want some?" "Yes," Cornelius said for the third time, and this time Domingo smiled and went inside. The coffee was good and the night was warm and the crickets were very loud, and somewhere in the middle of the third hour, from inside the house, came a sound that was entirely new in the history of the ranch, and Cornelius was on his feet before he had decided to stand up. Mrs. Clara appeared at the door shortly after. "You have a son," she said. "Mother and baby are both doing fine." The son was named James Thomas Watkins, after Cornelius's father and Augusta's grandfather respectively, and he was, in the unified opinion of everyone on the ranch, an excellent baby, which is to say he was a complete baby, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a considerable opinion about the world that he expressed at volume and without hesitation. Augusta held him in the bedroom with the evening light coming through the curtains she had put up herself in her first week, and looked at this new person with an expression that Cornelius, watching from the doorway, recognized as the one she wore when she was thinking about something larger than words could hold. She looked up at him. "Come here," she said. He came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she shifted James Thomas slightly so he could see his son's face, red and squinted and furious with the business of being alive. "Hello," Cornelius said to his son, which was not particularly eloquent but was true. James Thomas appeared unimpressed with this greeting and expressed his feelings accordingly. "He has your frown," Augusta told him. "That is not my frown," Cornelius said. "It is exactly your frown," she said, and she was laughing, softly, exhausted and laughing, and he took her free hand and held it, and they sat together in the warm evening of the Oklahoma Territory with their sun between them and the whole of the future spread out ahead of them like a second spring. The years that followed were years of building, in the way that things build when the foundation is right. The ranch grew. The Delacroix land, as Augusta had predicted, appreciated. The cattle operation expanded by another 100 head in 1886, and a dry goods merchant in Caldwell approached Cornelius about partnering in a small land speculation venture that Augusta reviewed with her surveying knowledge and her legal course training and declared sound, and which turned a modest profit by 1887. James Thomas grew with the vigorous efficiency of a child who had a great deal of ranch to explore, and two parents who believed that curiosity was not something to discourage. He was walking at 11 months and talking at 18 months, and by the time he was 3, he had a vocabulary that George Sutton described as slightly alarming for a person his size, and an attachment to the horses, particularly to Patience, who was now a dignified and well-cared-for fixture of the Watkins stable that was absolute and unwavering. In the spring of 1887, Augusta sat down with Cornelius after supper, which was now a ritual of the two of them at the kitchen table after James Thomas was in bed, and she said she had been corresponding with a women's legal education institution in Kansas City that had begun to offer a more formalized course in land law and property rights, and that she had been invited to submit some of her survey work and legal analyses as evidence of prior learning. "They said my work is equivalent to 2 years of coursework," she told him, with the controlled pleasure of someone who is genuinely pleased and is letting it be visible. "If I complete the remaining correspondence course requirements and pass the final examination, I would have a formal qualification." Cornelius looked at his wife across the supper table and thought about the first letter she had sent him, in which she had described herself as a woman who could cook and sew and manage a household. All of that was true. He had perhaps the most well-managed household in the Cherokee Strip, but it was the narrowest possible description of the person he had come to know. "You should do it," he said. "The examination is in Kansas City," she said. "In November, I would need to go for 2 weeks." "I know what November on a cattle ranch looks like," he said. "We'll manage. James Thomas will be fine," he said. "Domingo considers him a nephew. Mrs. Clara's niece has been looking for work. We'll arrange it." Augusta looked at him with the full direct gaze. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," he said. "Augusta, go to Kansas City, take the examination, get the qualification. You've been doing the work for 3 years. Get the paper that says so." She passed the examination. The certificate arrived in December, formal and official, and Augusta put it in a frame that Cornelius had bought in Caldwell specifically for the purpose, and hung it on the wall of what had been the front room and had become, by a gradual and entirely natural evolution, her office, the room where the ledger books lived and the survey maps were rolled and stored, and the correspondence files were kept in neat wooden boxes she had built herself from cedar. She stood and looked at the framed certificate on the wall for a long time, and Cornelius stood beside her. "Do you know what I keep thinking?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I keep thinking about the woman on the train platform in Richmond who had her ticket taken out of her hands," she said slowly. "I keep thinking about how much of those 18 months I spent being told what I was and what I was worth and what I should accept." She paused. "I keep thinking that the distance from there to here is very large, and that I am grateful for every mile of it." "So am I," Cornelius said. She turned and looked at him with the eyes that he had known for 3 years now, that he had woken next to for 3 years, that he could read with the thoroughness of someone who has given a thing his full and continuous attention, and what was in them was so complete and so sure that it required no additional language. He put his arms around her and held her in the room with the framed certificate on the wall, and she leaned into him with the same deliberate choosing she always brought to it, and the house was quiet around them and full. By 1888, James Thomas had a sister, a girl they named Clara after the midwife, because Augusta had wanted to honor the woman who had delivered them both safely, and because the name had a plainness and a strength that appealed to both of them. Clara was born in February, in the cold of a territory winter, and she arrived with the absolute certainty of a person who has fully intended to be here and sees no reason to arrive tentatively. She was, from the beginning, the kind of child who made everyone around her laugh, not because she tried to, but because she observed the world with such a concentrated and occasionally bewildered interest that the watching of her was itself a source of joy. Domingo Reyes, who by this point had taken on the role of full ranch foreman, was undone by her in the particular way that large, capable men are sometimes undone by very small, determined people, and could be found on a regular basis on the porch steps with Clara in his arms, explaining to her, in a mixture of English and Spanish, the names of the constellations, the techniques for reading weather in cloud formations, and the finer points of cattle management, none of which she was in a position to retain at 8 months old, but all of which she regarded with the focused attention that suggested she was filing it away for later. George Sutton, who was now 23 and had become a genuinely skilled cattleman over his years with the ranch, had in the spring of 1887 begun paying careful attention to the youngest daughter of the Caldwell blacksmith, a young woman named Ruth Harper, who was 19 and had, as Augusta observed with amusement to Cornelius, exactly the kind of direct and unintimidated manner that tended to appeal to people who had been working around Augusta Rhodes for a few years. Ruth and George married in June of 1888, and there was a celebration at the Watkins ranch that involved Edna Biggs's cake and a fiddle player from town and dancing in the yard until well past dark. Augusta danced with Cornelius under the stars, properly danced, which they had not done before, and she was very good at it, which surprised him. "Tobacco planter's daughter," she said, reading his expression. "I had a dancing education before the world fell apart. What else have you been holding back?" he asked, turning her in the pattern of the dance. She looked up at him in the lamplight, with the fiddle going and the yard full of people and the August stars enormous overhead. "Nothing of significance," she said, and there was the smile, the open, warm one, entirely his, and he drew her closer in the turn. They had a third child in 1890, another boy, whom they named Theodore, and who from the first moments of his life had the quality of a person who intended to take his time about everything, which was such a complete contrast to the determined velocities of James Thomas and Clara, that it was in itself a cause of constant gentle amusement. Theodore considered his surroundings with patience and equanimity, explored at his own speed, and was, as Clara had been, from his earliest days the subject of Domingo's patient educational monologues, which by this point had become a ranch tradition. Domingo himself had, in the autumn of 1889, married a woman named Esperanza, who was a schoolteacher in Caldwell, and who was, in Augusta's assessment, one of the most genuinely intelligent people she had met in the territory. Esperanza Reyes was from New Mexico, the daughter of a family that had been in the Southwest before Texas was Texas, and she brought to the Caldwell community a set of knowledge and perspectives that enriched it considerably, though not everyone in the community was immediately prepared to be enriched, which was a frustration that she managed with a combination of grace and absolute refusal to reduce herself. She and Augusta became close friends in the way that women who recognize each other's quality sometimes do, quickly, and without requiring a great deal of preliminary social maneuvering. The land opening of 1889, when the unassigned lands were finally open to homesteading in the great Oklahoma land run, changed the character of the territory profoundly and fast. Cornelius and Augusta watched it with the complicated feelings of people who understood what it meant, the land that had been designated for the Indian nations being opened piece by piece to settlement, the promises made and broken, the whole machinery of American expansion rolling over every prior arrangement it found inconvenient. They were part of that machinery in the simple fact of being here, and they knew it, and they tried to act with the consideration Augusta had once described, seeing it clearly rather than choosing not to. Their neighbor to the south, a Chickasaw man named Samuel Colbert, whose family had been farming that land since the removal, had 2 years of legal trouble over his title that Augusta, now qualified and practicing land law informally for the community, helped him navigate with her survey knowledge and her understanding of the relevant treaties. The title was ultimately secured. It was one of the small decent things available to them, and they did it. The year 1891 brought a drought, severe and extended, the kind that tested every operation in the territory. Cornelius and Augusta had laid reserves carefully enough over the previous years that they weathered it without catastrophe, but it required the renegotiation of the cattle schedule, the drawing down of reserve funds, and a 2-year period of tighter management that Augusta ran with the same unsentimental efficiency she brought to everything. They did not lose land. They did not lose stock in unmanageable numbers. When the rains came back in 1893, the ranch was still standing, still whole, battered but intact. Theodore, who was 3 during the worst of the drought, was old enough when it ended to remember it, and asked Augusta one evening why the ground had been so dry and angry. She sat with him in her lap in the rocking chair on the porch and explained whether to him in terms he could follow, and then she explained that sometimes the land was hard and that the people who stayed had to be harder than the land, and that hardness was not the same as coldness, that you could be hard and still be warm inside. Like Papa? Theodore asked. Very much like Papa, Augusta said. Cornelius, who had been reading on the porch and had heard this exchange, said nothing, because some things were better received in silence. In 1894, a letter arrived from Richmond, Virginia, that was not from Hensley Rhodes but from his wife, a woman named Josephine, whom Augusta had never met. Josephine wrote to tell Augusta that Hensley had died in the winter of pneumonia, and that before he died he had asked her to write to Augusta and tell her that he was glad she had written back 3 years ago, and that he thought of their childhood together with love, even if the years between had gone badly. Augusta read this letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with James Thomas at school and Clara at her lessons and Theodore building something with wooden blocks in the front room. She read it twice, and then she folded it and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Cornelius came in from the barn and saw her face and came and sat down. She told him. He took her hand across the table and held it, and she let herself be quiet for a while, which was rare for her, and the quietness was not emptiness but rather a particular kind of grief for the thing that had been lost before it was fully repaired, for the letter that had been answered but not answered quite enough, for the brother who had done a wrong thing and had spent years knowing it. "He knew I was all right," she said finally. "He knew where I was and that I was well. That's something." "It is," Cornelius said. "I'm glad I wrote back," she said. "I'm glad I didn't let the silence run until it was too late." She paused. "You were right that it was the right thing to do." "I only said it seemed like it," he said. "You were the one who did it." She looked at him with tired, clear eyes. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I was." He kept her hand and they sat in the kitchen together in the middle of the working day while the sun moved across the floor and Theodore could be heard in the front room conducting a serious conversation with his blocks about whatever architectural principle was currently concerning him. In 1895, James Thomas Watkins turned 11 and was already riding the range with his father and Domingo with the confidence of a boy who had been on horseback since he was 4 years old, and who had absorbed the rhythms of the ranch with the same thoroughness his mother brought to everything she undertook. He had Augusta's directness and her precision, and he had Cornelius's patience and his steadiness, and he was already the kind of person that Domingo declared, with the satisfaction of someone who had watched the whole of his formation, was going to be someone considerable. Clara, at 7, had decided that she intended to study law, which she announced at supper one evening with the completeness of a person who has thought about it carefully and arrived at a conclusion that is not subject to revision. "Like Mama?" Theodore asked. "Better than Mama," Clara said, with the honest ambition of 7 years old, and Augusta laughed and said that was exactly the right attitude. Theodore at 5 was still the thoughtful one, the observer, the one who sat very still and watched things before engaging with them, who asked questions that were occasionally startling in their depth, who was going to be, Augusta told Cornelius privately, either a philosopher or a naturalist, and probably both. Cornelius sat on the porch on an October evening in 1895 and looked out at the ranch in the blue going dark of the territory evening. The cattle settled in the far pasture, the barn solid and golden lit from within where Domingo was finishing up, the house behind him warm and loud with the sounds of 3 children, and a wife who was somewhere in that house. Engaged in one of the several things she was always simultaneously engaged in. He thought about the morning he had set 2 plates on the table for the first time and all the mornings after it, the 1097 before she came, and all the ones since that had been different, 2 cups both filled and drunk, 2 plates both used. He thought about the particular quality of an ordinary morning now, Augusta at the stove with Theodore on her hip, because he still liked to be carried at 5, and she indulged it without sentiment. James, Thomas, and Clara arguing about something at the table with the vigor of siblings who love each other and will not admit it. The smell of coffee and the sound of the territory waking up outside the window. He thought about the letter from his brother Wallace, 3 years late in the accounting, that had said a woman was looking for a man named Watkins in Abilene, and that she had looked like she had been through something considerable. He thought about the gate and the woman on the tired horse with the carpetbag tied with rope and the dark eyes that looked directly at you and did not flinch. He thought about 3 years of a second plate. It had been, in the end, the simplest thing he had ever done. He had decided something and he had held to it, not with drama or with declarations, but with the same daily steadiness he brought to every other thing on this ranch. And it had been, in every sense that mattered, the right thing to do. Augusta came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, and gave him one and wrapped her hands around the other, and they looked out together at the last of the light going over the Oklahoma territory. "James Thomas wants a dog," she said. "He's been wanting a dog for 2 years, Cornelius said. "I told him you would decide," she said. "You told him I would decide because you want us to have a dog," he said. A pause. "I may have wanted us to have a dog for some time," she said, in the tone she used when she was being precisely honest about something she found mildly amusing. He smiled, the smile that was rare enough to be notable. "I'll go to town on Friday and see what Hanson's dog turned up." "Thank you," she said. They were quiet for a while in the evening, and it was a deep and easy quiet, the quiet of 2 people who have said most of what needed saying over the course of years, and who have arrived at the place where silence is also a language, and one they are fluent in. The stars were coming out over the territory, brilliant and cold and close, the way they were on clear October nights when the air had gone thin and sharp with the first real edge of the coming winter. "Cornelius," Augusta said. "Yes," he said. "I'm grateful," she said. "I know I say things plainly and I don't always say all of them, but I want to say this plainly." She looked at him in the starlight, this woman who had rearranged his kitchen and fixed his fence line and read his letters back and named their daughter after the midwife and studied land law by lamplight and written back to her difficult brother and passed a Kansas City examination and danced with him under the stars at a ranch hand's wedding and sat with him through drought and grief and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life built together. "I am grateful for what you kept open. For the 3 years of holding on to something that had no guarantee. I know you said it cost you nothing, setting the extra place, but I think it cost you something, and I think it was worth it." He looked at his wife in the October evening of 1895 with the full weight of what she was and what they had built, and he said, "It was worth considerably more than it cost." Augusta nodded once, which was her way of receiving something that mattered deeply, and turned back to the view and the cooling coffee and the stars, and he turned back with her. Inside the house, Clara could be heard explaining to Theodore with considerable authority why her argument about something was correct and his was not, and Theodore was saying something in response that was measured and considered, and was probably, knowing Theodore, an excellent point, and James Thomas was most likely reading by the fire and pretending he was not listening to both of them. The dog, a large, good-natured brown animal of indeterminate ancestry from Hanson's latest litter, arrived on Friday and was named Justice by James Thomas, who had been thinking about it for 2 years and had his answer ready. Justice proved to be an excellent ranch dog, an excellent family dog, and a dog who seemed to understand that his primary function was to be present wherever the Watkins family was, which he performed with a thoroughness and reliability that was, in the opinion of everyone who knew him, a dog perfectly suited to the people he belonged to. The years continued to build on themselves in the way that good years do, one leading naturally into the next, each bringing its own weight and its own gifts, the children growing into themselves with the particular character each of them had arrived with, James Thomas steady and capable, Clara brilliant and determined, Theodore thoughtful and exact. Domingo and Esperanza had 3 children of their own by 1897, and the Watkins ranch and the Ray's household were tangled together in the deep way of families who have made each other's lives better for so long that the line between neighbor and kin has long since blurred into irrelevance. In the spring of 1898, when the newspapers were full of the war in Cuba, and the world was changing in the large ways that worlds change, Augusta and Cornelius sat on the porch on an evening in April and watched James Thomas, 14 years old, ride Patience's youngest offspring, a bay gelding he had gentled himself, across the near pasture in the long gold light of the afternoon, and the horse moved under the boy with a perfect ease that was the product of 2 years of patient, careful work. And it was one of the many moments that accumulated over the course of a life well lived, and lodged themselves permanently in memory. Augusta turned to him and said, quite suddenly, "I used to be afraid that I would arrive somewhere and find that the thing I had built toward in my mind was nothing like the reality of it, that the letters had made something in my imagination that the real thing couldn't support. What do you think now?" he asked. She looked at him with 17 years of knowing him behind her eyes, with 3 children and a ranch, and a framed certificate and yellow roses, and a door that had been kept open, with morning coffee and evening stars, and all the ordinary, extraordinary, specific days that constituted an actual life rather than an imagined one. "I think," she said, "that the reality was better than the imagination, considerably better, incomparably better." She paused. "I think you were better than I was capable of imagining, and I say that as someone with a reasonable imagination." He reached over and took her hand, as he had on the porch in August of 1880 for the first time, with the crickets and the stars and the new ground between them. She turned her hand over and closed her fingers around his, as she had then. Some things, he thought, remain the best version of themselves no matter how many times they happened. The yellow roses bloomed every summer along the porch rail, and every summer Augusta looked at them with the particular expression she had worn the first time she saw them, the one that moved through her like a current finding new ground, and every summer he saw her looking and thought about the man he had been when he planted them, the man who did not yet know her but had planted them anyway, because she had written in a letter that she loved yellow roses, and who had kept the door, and the place and the possibility open through 3 years and 1,097 mornings, and the quiet, stubborn faith of a man who had decided on something, and did not unmake his decisions without a reason. She had been worth every morning. She had been worth every year. She was worth, daily and completely, everything that had come after and everything that was still to come. And so in the spring and the summer and the fall and the long winter of every year, on the porch of the ranch northeast of Caldwell, with the territory sky enormous overhead, and the cattle in the pasture and the children in the house and the whole working living world of it going forward, Cornelius Watkins held his wife's hand and looked at what they had built together. And it was good, and it was whole, and it was exactly and precisely enough.